I'm speaking with my mom, Dr. Ethelene Jones. She is a retired OB-GYN and hospital administrator. In fact, she was the second woman and the second Black woman to be board certified as an OB-GYN in the state of Michigan. She retired about 20 years ago and lives in Florida here with me. My name is LeBeau Padnew. I happen to serve as the co-chair of the Green Party of Florida. You were going to say something, Mom? Did I get your CV wrong?
Yes.
Please, correct me.
I was never a hospital administrator. I was faculty at University of Wisconsin and later at the University of Michigan.
I thought you were faculty at administrator at Riverside. Was I wrong about that?
At Riverview, I was the vice chief of obstetrics and gynecology.
Understood. All right. Thank you. I want to have you retell to me a story about paper drives in your school.
I was an elementary school student, and each year the school would have a paper drive, which consisted of having students collect used newspapers and bring them to school to contribute. Apparently, the newspapers were then used to or sold to raise money for the school and school activities.
I'm going to pause you for 1 second. Mom, no one's going to have any idea of how old you are by looking at you. So can I give them an idea of what era we're talking about?
This would have probably been in the early 1950s. I was aware of the Red Scare at the time this occurred. And I was an elementary school student. Elementary schools in Detroit went through grade 8. The latest would have been 1954. We had a newspaper holder next to the fireplace where newspapers could be twisted up and thrown into this little hamper-like affair. And those newspapers were used to light logs in our fireplace. I gathered newspapers from there to take to school. My father found that that little hamper was empty, and he asked where were the newspapers that were in that little hamper, and I told him that I had taken them to school for the paper drive, and he became alarmed. He said that among the papers was a newspaper called the Daily Worker, and that the Daily Worker should never be taken out of the house. He explained to me that the Daily Worker, as I understood it, was a communist publication, and that people who read the Daily Worker would be subject to harassment, investigation, and bad things would happen if word got out that one was reading this newspaper. He impressed on me very strongly never to take the Daily Worker newspapers outside our home. My father's father was a carpenter on the railroad.
Got it. I got that wrong.
Boxcars and such. And his mother in Jacksonville was a teacher. His father was also a part-time minister, pastor of a small church. My father's education was paid for by the sister of his father, his paternal aunt, who was unmarried and had no children. My father was the apple of her eye. She was a domestic laborer, and as I understood it, she paid for his education through her savings. I'm not aware of her having an outside source of income, only her labor as a as a domestic worker. You're taking me to things that I heard of and some things that I lived through, but through the lens of a child.
That's perfect.
My
That's what I want.
my earliest memories are when I was 3 years old. My sister, brother, and I lived with my maternal grandmother. During that time, both of my parents, I believe, were in Washington. My father worked with a federal agency in LeBeau. It's a shame, but I don't remember what agency that was.
He used to work with the Department of Labor. I don't know if who he would have worked at during this era.
That sounds right. We probably need to review some of these records
Again, we can
before.
add stuff like this in between. We can add voiceovers. We can put images up on the
Okay,
screen. We can fill this out later.
okay. My mother was in Washington because she was attending medical school at Howard University. It was the war years. I was born in 1941. And during that time, the medical school curriculum was shortened to 3 years instead of 4. So for 3 years, my mother was in Washington attending medical school while her 3 children, including me, lived with my grandmother. At the end of that time, my parents took us to live in Detroit. I remember living in a little apartment over a garage the first few months or years. I don't know how long that was because I was a little kid.
Mm-hmm.
And then we moved into a house on American Avenue in Detroit. And I was raised in that house by my parents. My earliest memories of my father's job was in a law firm. I know that at some point he worked for the UAW. And I believe that came about because the man who became his very best friend, Ernest Goodman,
Mm-hmm.
established a law partnership. And the attorneys were Goodman, Crockett, Eden, and Robb. Eden and Goodman were Jews. Robb was a WASP, a white Anglo-Saxon Christian. And my father, of course, was a Black Christian. To our knowledge, this was the first integrated law firm in the nation. They concentrated at that time on immigration and labor law, 2 areas that were under attack, especially immigrants coming from communist nations were confronted, were challenged, were deported. And so a lot of my father's work was representing these immigrants, attempting to get fair hearings, fair trials for unsupported claims that they were conspiring to overthrow the government. One of the most famous trials in which he participated came about because a small group of attorneys in New York City committed to defending the leaders of the United States Communist Party. There were 12 leaders. They had been subpoenaed to come before the House On-American Activities Committee. The trial was held in Foley Square, New York City. It became the longest running trial in US history.
Federal trial.
Federal trial. During all of this time, my father was pretty much away from home. He was in New York. And the information that I got about the trial I got in part from what the newspaper said, from what neighbors and my teachers said, and from what my friends said. Two of the leaders on trial were from Detroit and had daughters my age. And my family were frequent guests at their dinner table, and they were frequent guests at our dinner table. That's where my mom learned to make authentic Italian spaghetti. During this trial, the names of these girls, not this trial, but the hearing before the House On-American Activities, the names of these girls were mentioned and besmirched. And as a result, they experienced harassment by schoolmates, by teachers. They were called communists. And this kind of uh, difficulty bonded the three of us more closely. My father, of course, was villainized in the papers, was called a communist, although he told me he was not a communist. He agreed to participate in this trial because attorneys, as a matter of their ethics, are expected to provide defense to people, regardless of their own personal feelings about what the defendant is accused of. Everyone is entitled to a fair hearing, to a jury by their peers, etc. And if attorneys only took cases of people whose politics or whose behavior they approved of, this constitutional right could not be supported.
Can I interject here for a quick
And so
moment?
that's what motivated, sure.
So I just want to give a little historical context. I've been reading a little bit on this subject. As I said, Granddaddy was the first black lawyer hired by the Department of Labor. He was hired by FDR, and as you know, FDR was the father of the New Deal. The reason that FDR was able to accomplish the New Deal was because there were three strong parties in the United States, two socialist parties and one communist party, that were out there organizing the workers throughout the Depression. Well, actually, it started before then. And they were able to come to him and explain to him that during the Depression, he didn't do something, that there would be trouble. There'd be rioting in the streets, there'd be violence, because the people were literally starving. People were selling their children. And it was with that pressure that the historical record says that Roosevelt was able to go to the leaders of industry and enough congressional people that he needed to get the New Deal passed, with the stick of there's this rising concern in the streets. That led to the New Deal. And from what I've read from the historical record, the business community never got over that. They always hated the New Deal and hated the fact they were forced into a position where they were forced to concede some things to the people. And I've been led to believe that the Red Scare was actually a backlash to that, to be able to dismantle the project of the New Deal, and to hopefully never find themselves in a position where they're forced to make concessions like that again. So now we're talking about the late 50s, I want to say, the mid 50s, correct? To get you back into your story. You're talking about HUAC. Oh, one more thing, we're talking about the mid 50s. This is kind of an amazing story because, like, Brown versus the Board of Education hadn't happened yet. And you're telling me a story about how you were hanging out in this Italian family's home on a regular basis, that the spaghetti recipe that I ate growing up in your house was passed down from your mom, from this particular family. And I do want to point out that it seems like a lot of people who were Red Scare people didn't quite so much like white people hanging out with black people at the time, as we saw with that the congressional thing that we read earlier. So that's just what I want to interject some context, and you can please continue. We were at HUAC and how these girls have been besmirched, I believe.
At this time, I was not aware of cultural hostility towards the friendships and relationships between. Can we pause? So I was not aware of things like that. I was aware of racial differences, and the way I became aware of them gradually from being a little kid is pretty remarkable when I look back on it. I imagine it similar to what other minority kids uh, go through, that slow awakening to an understanding that you are considered different and your competence, your legitimacy is questioned because of the way you look. Back to Foley Square. The judge was Judge Medina. I don't recall the judge's first name. I have probably since that time read parts of the transcript of that trial, especially the part having to do with the point at which Joe McCarthy was reading information about one of these girls who was the daughter of one of the defendants. And your grandfather, my father, interrupted and said something to the effect of, in view of your honors seemingly publicizing the name of an innocent child. So we were saying that in part of the transcript, I read that my father objected to the trial judge, Judge Medina, reading out the name of the daughter of one of the defendants, who was also a friend of mine, objected to his apparently inadvertently publicizing her name. The judge's response to that statement was to judge my father in contempt of court. And throughout the trial, the judge found reasons to charge each of the defendants and find them guilty of contempt. Each of the defendant attorneys found each of them in contempt of court. When the trial was over, he sentenced each of them to time in federal prisons, including my father. And of course, all of these matters were in the newspapers. Some of my neighborhood friends avoided me and told me that their parents had told them that they were forbidden to play with me and my brother and my sister because we were communists.
Children.
But to me, kind of like To Kill a Mockingbird, my father was a hero. My father was brave. My father stood up against prejudice and suspicion and the unfair victimization of people for their political beliefs, even to the point of going to prison for it. He wrote wonderful letters to each of his children during his time in prison, encouraging us in our studies, telling us how he loved us and how he missed us.
How long was he in prison for?
I believe it was 4 months.
Outside of the ostracism, how else did this impact the family?
My mother continued her medical practice during this time. My father had built a medical office in our basement and made an entrance with a stair entrance in the front of our home with a stairwell that led up to our walkway. And this permitted her to work pretty much at home with the three of us children upstairs. And of course, we would hear from her when we stomped or jumped or made too much noise on the floor, which was the ceiling of her office. Friends would come by the home and bring their kids to play with us and talk with my mom about the terrible situation going on in our nation, actually, and to commiserate. And they'd bring food, and they were very loyal. The law partners of my father's practice invited us to their homes, as they had before Dad went to New York and then on to Ashland, Kentucky for his stay in the federal prison. So we had support of really loyal friends, the vast majority of whom were white. The neighborhood that I grew up in was about half Polish and half black. We did not experience that kind of support, by and large, from neighbors, because the whole nation was immersed in this atmosphere of suspicion about who was communist and who wasn't. People would lose their jobs if it was found that they associated with folks who had been designated as fellow travelers or red leaning or pinko. There are a lot of terms for folks that were used to paint them as undesirables, as disloyal to their nation. During the time that Dad was away, I think my father was very supportive of George, told George he counted on him to take care of his mother and his sisters. I think George, too, experienced pride in my father, and I don't think that any of us three children were damaged by what my father did. Rather, it drew us together and made us very proud of him. I believe that what you're talking about, LeBeau, occurred after the New Bethel incident.
All right, so let's fast forward. Why don't you tell us about New Bethel incident? We're talking mid-'60s. So at this point, Granddaddy has been elected to the Recorder's Court. Is that correct?
Yes.
And the Recorder's Court, for those of you who don't know, was a very, I'm going to do my best to get this right, and if I will correct it afterwards if I'm wrong, was a very efficient court in Wayne County, Michigan. It was a county-level court, but they were so efficient that quite often they would be asked to take on Detroit area cases because the Detroit courts were not quite as efficient. Does that sound about right?
I don't know.
I know that was true near the end of the Recorder's Court. I don't know if it was true in this era of Granddaddy's time, but let's go ahead and talk about the New Bethel Church incident and the fallout from that.
The Recorder's Court was the Detroit Recorder's Court when I knew it. It subsequently and now has been converted into a county-wide circuit court. But at the time, it was Detroit Recorder's Court, and the judges were elected by Detroiters. That's my recollection.
Understood.
Okay. LeBeau, you need to understand in all of this, I am not going to be a font of knowledge about the political activities of my father. And the reason is that from my earliest memories, you know what I'm going to say?
No, I'm listening. I agree with you. I don't expect that from you. Go ahead.
From my earliest memories, I focused on becoming a doctor from my very earliest memories. Everything that had to do with my becoming a doctor guided me, absorbed my interest. And this is not something that was imposed on me by my parents. As a matter of fact, my earliest recollections of wanting to be a doctor go back to when I was 3 years old living with my grandmother and doing doing eye enucleations on a dead cat.
It's so gross, Bob.
To understand how does the eye work. I was aware at the time that my mother was in medical school. I learned in later years that when my parents got married, my father promised his betrothed's father that if ever he was able, he would send my mother to medical school. And then he always told us that he was quite ready to renege on that promise. In some ways, then, he evolved from the typical male chauvinist who felt that a woman's place is in the home and barefoot with children, to a man who was very happy to have a wife with a professional career and with civic activities that were nearly on a par with himself. My parents were very unusual in that they were mutually supportive of one another's work, careers, lives. There was never competition there, just pride and support. Something that is so rare, I've come to learn. That is so rare.
So at this point, we've not introduced the names of your parents. So why don't you say their names for us? And I'll make sure we get this back at the beginning of the video.
My father was George Crockett Jr., and my mother was Ethelene Jones Crockett, physician.
The first female and black female OB-GYN in the state of Michigan. Correct?
I'm sorry, say that again?
The first board-certified female and black female OB-GYNs board certified in the state of Michigan. Is that correct? Your mother
She was the first black female to be board certified in obstetrics and gynecology in Michigan.
And you were the second?
Yes.
All right. All right, so let's go ahead and continue the impact of the FBI in our family. I understand that you are not going to be a fount of knowledge of the political situation. I'm contacting you because you're a primary source. I believe that if people want to know his political career, they can go on Wikipedia or U.S. House of Representatives.gov or whatever else. I want to get those parts of the story that that they wouldn't be able to find there. So I don't expect you to I understand that there are going to be holes in your recollection. Any place that you don't know, just say, I don't know, I don't remember. And we'll look it up and put it up on the screen.
Okay. What I learned about my father's politics, I usually learned at the dinner table. Our family had dinner every day at 5:30. No excuses. You were to be at home at the dinner table. It was a time we could count on, if everybody was in town, all of us being together. And the dinner table conversation was my mother talking about her day, her interests, her concerns. My father doing likewise. And each of my siblings and myself were asked to report on anything of interest we wanted to contribute and any questions we wanted to ask. At the dinner table is where I learned a lot about what was going on in the outside world from my parents. The family watched the evening news. There was one news hour. You didn't have the news 24 hours that we have now. So we generally all watched the news together. Therefore, things that I can tell you about from early years of my life in relationship to what my father was doing come about pretty much from the dinner table conversations, from the family friends perhaps who joined us at dinner or who we joined their households at dinner, all filtered through the ears of a young, naive sort of person that I was. Oh, yes. At in our family, academic success, commitment to one's studies, uh, was the job of us children. We received praise or shame in large measure based on how we did in school, how we did in our chores, how we treated other people. These things were important too. But your achievements in school were very important. They were important because they made your parents proud of you when you did well, and they made your parents ashamed of you when you didn't. So in school, academically, I did well, but I was a chatterbox, and I would talk out of turn. And our report cards had opened up like a little folder. And on the left side were the academic subjects and your grades. And on the right side were self-discipline. What else was in there? There were three categories of behavior. I would bring home a report card that had excellent academic grades and always bad grades, unsatisfactory grades were written in red ink. The right side of my report card was always full of red inks, unsatisfactories in each of those three areas.
Was this an integrated school or was this a black school?
It was an integrated school. And as I recall, both of my parents had something to do with that school and other Detroit schools being integrated. I don't recall if it was through lawsuits, but I think it was. I think there were lawsuits that required desegregation of Detroit public schools. The area I lived in, which was Polish and black, attended a school that was north of our community. North of the school were all white neighborhoods. There was redlining in those days, and there were restrictive covenants that restricted people from selling their homes to non-whites. So the school was in an area bounded by an integrated neighborhood and a white-only neighborhood, and had students from both areas.
All right, so
in that school,
yes, okay.
In that school, there was overt prejudice, and that's probably one of my earliest recollections of learning that I was different in a way that was not to my advantage. I remember at dinner table my sister complaining that a boy in her class called her the N-word and did it in such a way repeatedly that she was crying, and her teacher sent her to the office because she was disrupting the class with her crying. And the office, the assistant principal, Miss Thompson, asked her why she was crying, and she explained that this classmate called her a nigger. And the assistant principal's response was, "That's nothing to cry over. You are a nigger." This is the kind of attitude in our schools.
So it's not surprising that you had red marks on everything that's objective while doing very, very well on everything that's objectively graded, is kind of what I was hitting at.
No, I would not make that connection at all, because among my teachers, by and large, I was not aware of racial prejudice. If it was there, I wasn't aware of it. I just talked and talked and talked. I talked while the teacher was talking. And that was, strict discipline. That was not permitted. So I always brought home these report cards that were very disappointing to my parents with all the red marks. However, on the year you're talking about, I had an art class, and in art we made things out of paper mache, and we colored things, and we learned how to draw to show perspective. And I was just fascinated with the art class. I didn't have any talent, but it was a class in which you did stuff, and it commanded your attention. I was absorbed in art. And to my surprise, when my report card came that semester, I had a honors grade in self-discipline and the other two topics. There were all the red marks, but there was this one black honors in art. I skipped home. I was just so proud of myself. I knew my parents would be so proud of myself. I was so happy. I was so gratified with this achievement. And as I skipped up the walkway, I looked up and I saw this massive, muscular, very black man seated on our front porch. And on either side of him were two other black men, both of whom had guns in holsters. And I stopped in my tracks.
I can imagine.
The big man spoke to me and said that I seemed to be very, very happy. Why was I so happy? And he had this resonant voice, and he looked one in the eye, and he was so engaging. He was really interested in why I was so happy. And he was the first person that I told my good news to, that I got honors in self-discipline, and my daddy and my mommy were going to be so proud of me. And he asked to see my report card, and he looked at it, and he told me he was proud of me too. And then I skipped on into the house. I skipped on into the house and announced to everyone inside that I got an H in self-discipline. The big man with the wonderful voice and the wonderful smile, and those two scary men with their guns, stayed for dinner. And my dad introduced me to this big man. His name was Paul Robeson, and he was a singer. Years later, I realized why Paul Robeson was sitting on the front porch of my home. It was because he had been subpoenaed to appear before the House Un-American Activities, and Dad was his attorney.
All right, let's do some more HUAC talking. And you may not know this, and so this may not be your forte. Mayor Coleman Young, HUAC and Granddaddy. What do you know about that?
That Dad represented him before the House Un-American Activities Committee. He was not a mayor at the time. He was a UAW labor leader.
There's a story I hear, once again, from my history of Detroit, which may or may not be 100% accurate, that his testimony before HUAC, Young's testimony before HUAC, was kind of what propelled him into the limelight in the city of Detroit. Apparently, people used to pass around recordings in the city of Detroit of his testimony. And there's a famous line. Apparently, he was one of the first people to actually be defiant to HUAC. And he's a famous line where they ask him to point out any current or former communists that he may have worked with at the UAW. And he responded with a line, something along the lines of, "You, sir, have me confused with a stool pigeon." And I've been led to believe that that act of defiance is kind of what gave him some of the juice that he had in Detroit later on when he got elected to mayor in the late 60s, I want to say. Is that right?
That's interesting, because I don't remember there being recording devices, tape recorders.
And that's why I say that it seems that I'm wondering if I got that right, because I agree with you that I know I've read that people used to pass around his testimony, and I think that maybe because I was a kid, I just assumed that there were like tapes and things back then, but perhaps it was just transcripts or discussion of it or whatever. But I do know that in the little red book of Coleman Young's quotes, that is one of the prominently placed quotes. "You, sir, have me confused with the school pigeon."
Well, you'll recall something. I once asked you and your sister and your brother if you were aware that a student, your classmate, was cheating on a test. You saw it with your own eyes. And you were called in by school authorities and asked, did this person cheat on that test? What would you do? And my recollection is that you, your sister, and your brother all said that you would tell the truth. Yes, that person cheated on the test. The reason I brought that question to you is because during the Red Scare years, some things that your parents tell you, you remember all your life. My father told us, never be a stool pigeon, for reasons that in retrospect are pretty obvious. The teachers who lost their jobs, the people who were harassed, the people who were publicly humiliated in the days of the House Un-American Activities Committee. But that principle, never be a stool pigeon, stayed with me all my life. And as an adult, appreciating how never disclosing illegal activity that you know of interferes with justice. It has left me conflicted all my life. I wondered what I had passed on to my 3 children on this topic. And that's why, out of the blue, seemingly, I, pondering this, asked the 3 of you and was actually shocked at your responses. That yes, you would tell.
I don't remember this, but also consider the fact that we may have seen this as a test of our morality. And maybe not giving you maybe we gave you the answer we thought you wanted to hear without even considering the question itself. I don't know. I don't remember the situation, but I can see myself being a small child and being asked basically like, hey, by my mom and my dad, hey, would you help somebody cheat? And would think that might be some kind of trap,
Well, of course it is a moral question. It is an ethical question.
But it hadn't occurred to us that the ethics of it might run the other way, is I guess what I'm saying. Possibly. I don't know. All right, so it's been almost an hour, so I'm going to give you a little breathing space, but I do want to hit a couple more subjects. We never, even though it's not a different subject, we were mainly talking about the Red Scare since we began on it. I would like to talk about the New Bethel Church incident and the recently declassified FBI documents that you got to peruse not too long ago, in the last couple of years.
Okay.
So, New Bethel Church, Recorder's Court. What happened? To the best of your recollection, and
My telling of the story.
Right, exactly.
I was a resident in obstetrics and gynecology at Providence Hospital, Southfield, Michigan. I came to the hospital early in the morning, was at the scrub sink scrubbing to assist an attending physician on a case. The attending physician came in, began scrubbing next to me, and asked me what the hell was wrong with my father. And I said, what's wrong with him? I don't know what you're talking about. And he said, your father released a crowd of criminals from custody. Just turn them loose. What's wrong with your father? I told him I didn't know anything about this. And as soon as I was out of surgery that morning, I called my father, and I remember precisely what I said. I said, Daddy, what did you do? And he said what he usually says as an opener in times like this. He said, well, my dear. And then he went on to explain that the night before, Coleman Young had come to our home. He was the UAW leader, had come to our home. Actually, I shouldn't say our home because I was married and living in another home. But come to my parents' home, awakened my father, and told him that the police had rounded up men, women, and children in the aftermath of a shooting at the New Bethel Baptist Church in Detroit. The story was that the Republic of New Africa, a militant black organization in Detroit, was holding a meeting in the church that police put the church under surveillance, and that a shot, at least one, was fired from the church at the police, wounding an officer. This led to calls going out, and the church was quickly surrounded by police officers who broke into the church and, as Coleman Young stated, rounded up everyone in that church, took them to the basement of the police department garage, and held them without access to attorneys and without specific charges, without any sort of a hearing. Dad was a judge in Recorder's Court at the time. He went to the police garage and he held court there in the police garage, requiring that each person who had been arrested be brought before him, and that the charges against them had to be stated and evidence presented. Habeas corpus hearings, these are called. Show reason why this person should be detained. The result of this was that nearly all of the people who were held were released. A few were charged because they were found to have gunpowder residue on their hands. This particular incident of police summarily, even children, rounding up indiscriminately this whole group of people, keeping them incommunicado. They could not get legal representation. And Judge Crockett, a black judge, first of all, a black judge, turning all those people loose. To the white police department, this was an unbearable imposition on their authority. Who did he think he was? To the black community in Detroit, a judge who courageously stood up against the Detroit Police Department, which was either entirely or overwhelmingly white in a community that was perhaps majority black by then, I don't recall. To the black citizens of the city, Judge Crockett became an overnight hero. And throughout the city, you saw people with bumper stickers that said, "Support Judge Crockett." And you saw people with bumper stickers that said, "Impeach Judge Crockett." The family home was under surveillance by plainclothes police in unmarked cars. A complaint was made to the Judicial Tenure Commission of would that be Wayne County or the state? I don't recall. Probably the state. Anytime a judge was accused of misusing his office, of doing something illegal or unethical, it was the Judicial Tenure Commission that heard the charges, deliberated, and rendered up an action or an opinion. It might be an action that simply, what's the word I'm trying to think of?
Like a rebuke or a censure?
Censure, yeah. They might censure the judge, they might remove the judge from office, or they might support what the judge did and render a decision explaining why what the judge did was appropriate. It took some time, as I recall, a matter of weeks, for the Judicial Tenure Commission to release its findings. And when it did, it found that Judge Crockett had done precisely what the law required, that he had promptly provided habeas corpus proceedings to determine whether or not each of those persons who was being held should be held or released. That our Constitution required this kind of swift response to give justice to people so charged. I think that many in Detroit were surprised at this ruling, but it was in the Constitution. This further enhanced the reputation of Judge Crockett. But as you ask me about the picture behind you of my brother, during this time between when the New Bethel incident happened and when the Judicial Tenure Commission released its opinion, the phones were tapped. As I mentioned, the house was under surveillance. There was this hue and cry throughout the city focused on Judge Crockett.
Both papers called for his impeachment, if I remember correctly.
Newspapers called for his, yes, called for his impeachment. This had it caused a great deal of stress on our family. And it particularly affected my brother, who's named after his father. He's George Crockett III. His response was to feel very protective towards his father and to be especially affected by the surveillance and the phone tapping and the calls for impeachment, the attacks on his father.
I want to pause you here. If I understand correctly, some of this information you have, or at least have verified through recently declassified documents. But at the time, if you suspected your phone was tapped, there wasn't like you could call someone and find out. So, you know, if you saw a car parked out in front of your house, well, is that the cops coming to kill you, or are you paranoid? I want to give people a sense of what it might be like to live through that. Like as I said, if I understand correctly, you weren't able to verify for sure that these things were going on until decades later. Is that correct? Like when the government actually admitted that we did these things.
That's correct, but it was really obvious.
Right.
Black cars. In our street, each home had a driveway, and families parked their cars in their driveways. You seldom saw cars parked on the street unless it was someone coming to visit. No one comes to visit at 3 and 4 in the morning. There were these unmarked black cars on our street, across the street from our home or next door to our home. And when one of the black cars would leave, another one would take its place. It was obvious that we were under surveillance. And if I had read, or the family had read somewhere that that was not true,
Got it.
Wouldn't even bother to challenge it. It was so obvious.
All right, so let's go back to Uncle George.
The stress on Uncle George was such that he had a nervous breakdown and was hospitalized for maybe some weeks. He had also recently married, and he was hospitalized because he developed paranoia. And that paranoia, it extended to everyone around him, and that's why he was hospitalized. But it put a great strain on his marriage and resulted in his being separated from his wife and subsequently divorced from his wife, who was his childhood sweetheart of many years. I don't think my brother ever fully recovered from that. He was at an age in which mental illness commonly first presents itself in his mid-20s. But with medication, he was normal and he functioned very well throughout his entire career. But that's one of the tolls that this kind of attacks on my father for his politics took on our family.
I want to talk about some of the impact that Granddaddy had on Detroit. I recently read an article by, I want to say it was CARE. It was some organization that fights discrimination against Muslims. And they were recounting the New Bethel Church incident. And they actually credited Granddaddy with putting off the Detroit riots for a year or two. Apparently there are scholars who believe that that would have led to the riots that broke out a couple years later had that situation not been handled to some degree in the way that it was. And I do want to point out that the Detroit riots were in fact set off by the police. The ones that actually happened in 67, is that right, 67? It started off with the police raid of a late night poker game, apparently, or speakeasy. The city burned for days, and literally never recovered. And I like to tell a story. I spent a year at Morehouse, and Morehouse is in Atlanta, Georgia, and Granddaddy came to visit, and my father came to visit at the same time. And Granddaddy took us to the Omni Hotel, which is the CNN headquarters, and we had lunch there, brunch there, something like that. So we're sitting there eating lunch, and all of a sudden I hear from behind me, "Oh my God, Judge Crockett!" just screaming across the room. And I turn around, and there's this black waiter there, and he comes over, and, you know, this is years ago. This is maybe 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, actually. But it was like the reverence that he had. The guy just lost his shit. And, you know, having been a waiter for many years, I know that, like, it takes a lot to get you on the floor to just act a fool. And this guy couldn't believe that Judge Crockett was in his presence, in his restaurant, because he was one of the dudes in that church. And the story he told was, after that incident, he realized that Detroit was doing nothing for him, and he left Detroit as soon as he got out of jail and never looked back, and that his life had never been better, and he just could not thank Granddaddy enough for basically, he felt like saving his life. This would have been 91, 92, so we're talking, was that 26 years later? And this guy, you know, just being in his presence because of the New Bethel incident, went nuts about it. And I do want to, I'm probably going to talk to Kim about this one, but Uncle George also went on to have some serious impacts in the city and maybe prevented some riots with the Mallets Green case, which was basically that happened before Rodney King, didn't it? That was a proto Rodney King. That was like the test case.
Yeah, well in advance of Rodney King.
Rodney King, Mallets Green was a black man who was stopped by the police. I think may have been in a drug house, and they killed him. 3 cops just straight up killed him. And in this case, they actually faced justice, and there wasn't even video.
They stopped him in his car and questioned him. And the story is that he reached for his glove compartment to show his insurance or his driver's license or something that he had in there. And they shot him with a claim that they thought he was reaching for a gun. There was no gun in his glove compartment, of course.
And so Uncle George was the judge in that case. I believe Budson and Nevers were the 2 who were found guilty, and there was a 3rd who was found not guilty. And they and their lawyers spent at least a decade trying to ruin his career after that. For example, the story was such a big deal in Detroit that the jury was sequestered. And to give you a feel of when this was, are you sure this is before Rodney King? Because I'm pretty sure one of the problems was the fact that he sequestered them, and the hotel that they were sequestered in had shown the movie Malcolm X, which is a Spike Lee movie. And they tried to claim that because that movie was showing, and yeah, it was after Rodney King or around the same time, because the Rodney King beating was the first scene in that movie, that therefore the jury should be thrown out and everything else. So I think that it probably happened around the same time. Right. And then by the time it came to trial and everything, Rodney King had already happened. But I do believe it happened before Rodney King. But yeah, they tried to get that overturned time and time again. They came after him, dispersed his name, and I believe they ended up serving almost their whole sentence, if I'm not mistaken. All right, I'm going to call it quits here. I really thank you for your time.
And you haven't even asked me about my freshman year in medical school.
We're going to get to that. That'll be a whole other different subject by itself. This one,
and Martin Luther King.
I don't know the Martin Luther King story, but I
came to the house.
Oh wow!
And I answered the door.
All right, you tell me this story. I've never heard this story.
No, we'll save that for another time because I've got